Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video we'll be looking at the intracellular erythrocyte reactions part 2, alright? So go and watch my part 1 video where we talked about what happens as CO2. We took a muscle cell, for example, and we said what happens in a capillary once our red blood cell comes near our muscle cell, how the CO2 dissolves from high to low concentration into the plasma, then into the red blood cell, and how it competes with oxyhemoglobin, and then how carbaminohemoglobin forms, which is just pretty much carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin. And also we said that a hydrogen proton is produced, which also competes with oxyhemoglobin, sorry about that, and which kicks off more O2 off of the hemoglobin, right, the iron heme groups. And so all those kicked off extra O2 molecules then go to the muscle cell where we can do cellular respiration, and then we can create the energy we need in the muscle cell, right? So we said all that, and we also said some important things like, let's go and write it down here since it's not that clear, that the main way that our blood, right, we carry oxygen is right here that we saw through oxyhemoglobin, right? So that's the main way. So the main way we carry oxygen is through oxyhemoglobin, all right? And we said the other main way is that we get some dissolved oxygen in the plasma, all right? So that's another main way, is that some oxygen gets dissolved in the plasma. And remember, we're coming from the lungs here, all right? So some oxygen gets dissolved from or into the plasma, sorry about that, into the plasma. All right, so, but remember that oxyhemoglobin is the main way oxygen is carried from the lungs and to the rest of your tissues, right? Because oxygen is the main, is what's gonna bind to the hemoglobin, all right? That's why hemoglobin's there, for oxygen to bind, and you can get many conditions related to that if you have less iron in your body, right? You can get iron deficient anemia, because the iron is a main integral part of the heme groups in your hemoglobin. So if you don't have much iron, you can't have much oxygen binding to your hemoglobin, right? So that's bad, because then you'll start delivering less oxygen to your tissue. So that's why just know that oxyhemoglobin pretty much just means oxygen bound to the hemoglobin, and that's the main way of carrying oxygen throughout the blood, all right? And the other main, not the main way, but the other way that we do carry oxygen throughout the blood, it's very little amount of oxygen, but it's through being dissolved in the plasma. All right, so this is for oxygen. But what about for CO2? How is CO2 carried in the blood? Well, one way, right, we said was carbaminohemoglobin, right, the competition, where CO2 competed with oxyhemoglobin, kicked the crap out of oxygen out, right, and then the products ended up with carbon dioxide winning, and now it's bound to hemoglobin, and this is carbaminohemoglobin, so I'm going to write that down, carbaminohemoglobin, right, and then so that was one way of carrying carbon dioxide through the blood, is carbaminohemoglobin. So let's go and write that down, right? So for carbon dioxide, one way is through carbaminohemoglobin, all right? So that's the first way. Now the next way, or the main way that we said, was through the form of bicarb, all right? So what we said here, right, was that there was water in the red blood cell, and when CO2 came from the muscle cell into the plasma and into the red blood cell, CO2 reacted with water, making carbonic acid, but it didn't do that by itself. We needed a catalyst, or carbonic anhydrase, right? Once we got the carbonic acid, we saw that it dissociated into a hydrogen cation and bicarb, right? So I'm going to write that down. So right here, actually, no, I already wrote it down right here. So it traveled over here, right? So let's go over here. So it dissociated into a bicarb and a hydrogen cation. So then we said that the bicarb went dissolved into the plasma, right? And we'll see what happens now in this video when it gets to the lungs. And then we said that the H plus again competed with the oxyhemoglobin, and then winning, right? It wins, kicks O2 off. O2 goes to the muscle cell, which is what we want. And we have H plus bound to hemoglobin. So that's the main things we said. So this is the main way of carrying CO2 throughout the blood, and we'll see why it's the main way and how it becomes CO2 again near the lungs. And then our last way again is the same as our second way for oxygen, is that some CO2 can be dissolved in the plasma. All right, some CO2 gets dissolved in the plasma. All right, so this was for CO2, the main ways of carrying that in the blood. So now let's see what happens when this red blood cell makes its way back into or near the lungs, all right, near the pulmonary capillaries, all right. So let's go ahead and see that. So let's go and draw another big, okay, so let's go and draw another big red blood cell here, all right. And so we're going to say that this red blood cell, so let me go ahead and really fix this. So this is a red blood cell, and this red blood cell right now, we're going to say is it's coming down into the pulmonary capillaries, right, ready to get oxygenated. So we have this red blood cell in the pulmonary capillaries, all right, so it's in a pulmonary capillary, let's say. So it's kind of like a zoomed in version, all right. So, and then now we're going to have to draw our zoomed in version of, let's just draw one big alveolus, right? Remember from our cardiovascular system and even our COVID-19 videos, we know that we have alveoli in our lungs. So let me go ahead and draw one big alveolus. And we know that our alveoli in our lungs are air-filled sacs where the gas exchange occurs via our type 1 pneumocytes, right? But this, we're just going to keep it simple in terms of drawing, right? So we're going to have, so we breathe in, oxygen comes down, right, through your bronchi, then your bronchioles, and finally to your alveoli. So we're going to have a bunch of oxygen here, right? And we don't only breathe oxygen, right, because the air isn't only oxygen. There's other gas particles like nitrogen, right? So nitrogen actually makes up most of the air that we breathe in, but there's nitrogen, there's oxygen, we have carbon dioxide, another very small percentage of gas particles. Not really important right now, so we're just gonna keep in mind of the oxygen, all right, because that's the main thing that we have to focus here. Because remember, we're trying to build up to the future videos of our blood system, right, of our hematology playlist that we're going to talk about, like the Haldane effect, all right, so it's going to come in, or it's actually going to play a part in the lungs also. So we have oxygen here, right, and in our pulmonary capillary, what do we have right now? I mean, in our red blood cell, okay, in our pulmonary capillary, we had carbaminohemoglobin, all right, so I think we should go and write down all the reactions that we saw earlier, because we'll see that we can use the Le Chatelier's principle in order to see how the reaction drives backwards, and how we'll see the Haldane effect, all right? But we'll talk about the Haldane effect and Bohr effect, like I said, again, in a future video. All right, so let's just go and write the reactions that we had earlier when we were near the muscle cell. Okay, so CO2, remember, competed with our oxyhemoglobin. That yielded that, so CO2 won the fight, all right? So now we have carbaminohemoglobin, so carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin. Then we had a byproduct of hydrogen cation and oxygen that was kicked off with oxyhemoglobin. What else did we have going inside? Well, we had water combining with CO2 to make our carbonic acid, right? Our carbonic acid. So let me go and, sorry about this, we're trying to erase that. Okay, so H2O and CO2 will make carbonic acid, but it can't do that by itself. We need a catalyst, right? So what is this catalyst called? It's called carbonic anhydrase. All right, let me go and write that neater. So carbonic anhydrase. All right, and we said that then carbonic acid can then go ahead and dissociate into a cation or a hydrogen cation and bicarb, right? And then we said bicarb went to the plasma, right? Most of the bicarb went and dissolved into the plasma, and we said that we would wait and see what happens so we get back to the lungs. So let's say this is the plasma near the lungs, right? And we're still in our pulmonary capillary, by the way, all right? Because remember, plasma is in our blood vessels, okay? So we have plasma here, and bicarb is diffused or is dissolved in at the moment, all right? Because remember, this red blood cell, guys, is coming back from the muscle cell. All right, so let's go and say that. So is coming back from the muscle cell. All right, because then we'll be able to relate it well. So it's coming back from the muscle cell. That's why we have all this competition going on. All right, and remember, so once we get this hydrogen cation here and here, the hydrogen cation will then compete, remember, near the muscle cells. So remember, guys, I'm just rewriting all the reactions that we saw in the previous video in our red blood cell near the muscle cell, okay? So, because it'll help us right now. So I'm just quickly going over it. So then we had our hydrogen cations competing with our oxyhemoglobin to do what? To kick off oxygen and to attach our hydrogen cation onto our hemoglobin. So we ended up with this, right? And we kicked off oxygen. So these were the main reactions that were happening inside our red blood cell near our muscle cell, all right? And then remember, all these extra oxygens left, right? Left this red blood cell and entered the muscle cell, all right? But now, let's see what happens when we come near the alveoli of the lungs, which is full of oxygen, right? Which is what a red blood cell needs right now. So now what's going to happen? It's going to be easier to see now because now there's high concentration of oxygen here, low concentration of oxygen in the red blood cell, right? So there's higher concentration of oxygen in the alveoli, lower concentration of oxygen in the red blood cell. Similarly, there's higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the red blood cell, and there's low concentration, right, of carbon dioxide in the alveoli, right? So this is for the alveoli, or in this case, it's alveolus, right, because it's just one big alveolus. So what do we know about concentration gradient, right? We know that molecules like to flow from high concentration to low concentration, all right? Same thing here. The CO2 will flow from the high concentration, which is in the red blood cell, to the alveolus, right? And we breathe that out. So what's going to happen is that we're going to start seeing oxygen start to diffuse in, all right? Because it's passive diffusion, right? Because it's going from high to low concentration. So oxygen go that way, and what we're going to see is that we'll go over Le Chatelier's principle in a future video, but pretty much what Le Chatelier's principle is that if we look at this reaction right here, it pretty much says if you increase any compound in the reaction, right, inside the reaction. So if we were to increase, let's say we were to increase the concentration of hydrogen cations. So because we increase the concentration of hydrogen cations, Le Chatelier's principle says that the equilibrium of the reaction will shift the opposite direction. So if we increase the number of concentration of hydrogen cations, then the reaction will shift to the right because it's trying to balance out the equilibrium state. All right, same thing here. If we decrease the hydrogen cations, the concentration of hydrogen cations, then since we decrease the reactant side, right, our reaction would shift to the left because we decreased the reactant, so we're trying to compensate by shifting to the left. All right, so just remember, if you mess with one side, the other side's going to compensate. So again, guys, if I decrease the concentration of hydrogen cations, right, I decrease the concentration. Well, how am I going to increase it back up? I will have to make more reactants, right, by shifting the whole reaction to the left so I can balance the reactant side again because we just decreased the number of hydrogen cations. All right, same thing. If we increase the number of hydrogen cations, we'll have to shift the reaction to the right because there's too much, so we need to balance it out. So same thing happens here. We see that when our red blood cell is leaving the muscle cell and is now coming near the pulmonary capillary, near the oxygen-filled alveoli in the lungs, oxygen diffuses from high to low concentration, and because of this, we see that the oxygen concentration starts to increase in the red blood cell. What does that mean? Guys, we just went over in the Le Chatelier's principle, is that now if we increase the oxygen, if you see in this equation, if we increase the oxygen concentration, what's going to happen? Our reaction is going to shift to the left to balance the product side out, right? Because we have a lot of oxygen now in the product side, so we need to shift the opposite way so we can balance the product side out. So what does that mean is that all of these reactions that kicked out the oxygen, guys, is actually going to get pushed backwards. So what does that mean is that oxygen is going to gain back its place as oxyhemoglobin now. So look what happens. So now instead of this reaction right here, so if we increase oxygen here, the reaction is going to shift to the left. So what's going to happen is I'll write it down here in a different color, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say oxygen. So I'm writing this reaction down. What happens, right? So we just literally write it backwards because of Le Chatelier's principle, right? So oxygen plus hydrogen cation plus our carbaminohemoglobin will now actually go backwards, all right? We'll shift because we're shifting to the opposite side, right? Because of Le Chatelier's principle. And now we're going to kick off the CO2 that was bound to the hemoglobin, and we're going to gain our oxyhemoglobin back, which is what we want. We need oxygen bounded to the hemoglobin, so our process of cardiac, or process of our heart and lungs working together and pumping oxygen and blood throughout the body can keep on happening. All right, so this reaction shifts backwards, and the same thing will happen for this reaction, right? So because there's more oxygen, we're going to now kick off the hydrogen cation from the hemoglobin and gain back our oxyhemoglobin status. So I'll write this reaction down here, all right? So it's still in the red blood cell, let's keep that in mind. So then what we're going to see is that oxygen is going to, again, now is going to start competing, right, with the hydrogen cation that's bound to hemoglobin, and oxygen will win because there's so much oxygen coming from the alveolus that we have such a high concentration of oxygen that we're going to regain our place of oxyhemoglobin and kick the crap out of the hydrogen cation. All right, so now we have oxyhemoglobin back to normal. And so we have a high percentage of our saturation of oxygen that's bound to the hemoglobin. And again, the cycle will continue, right? Because then this red blood cell will then go to our muscle cells or whatever, if we keep our muscle cell example, right? And once the red blood cell reaches our muscle cell, we're going to have the same process occur again. All the CO2 in the muscle cell is going to diffuse in, right? We're going to get competition again, or the oxyhemoglobin, and that cycle is going to repeat itself. All right, so this was what happened. This is what happened when the oxygen from the alveolus diffused into the red blood cell, but we never talked about what happens to the CO2, right? What happens to the CO2 now? How does it get back into the alveoli, right? It's mainly diffusion, but we have to see our main component of carbon dioxide that we carried, right? Remember we said bicarb was the main way we carried carbon dioxide. So we have to see how that works now. All right, because in the next video, we'll see that because all of this hydrogen cations are now getting produced near the lungs, all the bicarb that was initially dissolved near the muscle cell starts to come back inside the red blood cell and actually starts to combine with the hydrogen cations to form carbonic acid. And then we know that carbonic acid, right here, can dissociate back into CO2 and H2O. So via the carbonic anhydrase enzyme. All right, so it can also go backwards. And we'll see that in the next video. So hopefully I see you guys in the next video. All right.